I'm going to skip here. This is some more of the stress response, and it's showing you that it is your hypothalamus that we talked about. That's the part of the brain that is affected by the stress. And then it triggers the other parts of the body that produces the hormones, like the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland that produces these hormones. So this is, and it releases, these hormones is what cause a major role in depression, because this is usually lowered in people with depression. All right? Here we'll talk about the cortisol. The cortisol, it is a hormone that is being released in the body when it is in a stress response. Okay? So the boost of cortisol in your body readies your body for fight or flight. So this is what we're talking about. The hormone cortisol, which the body creates, the hormone creates, your pituitary gland and your adrenal gland creates this hormone, and it readies your body for fight or flight. And this is why your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, your senses are sharpened. You hear better, you see better, you're more alert because you're preparing to do battle. This should not go on for a very long time. This should be short-lived, and then you return to normalcy. You understand what I'm saying? So usually when that continues for a lengthened amount of time is when you run into the danger. All right? This is going to talk about, I'm going to skip through that. It's a little bit more technical. So here in John chapter 14, verse 27, the Lord says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." So when you come up to that stressful life event, when things are going on in your life that causes you to panic and to be afraid, who should you call on to? God. He will be there for you. Even in that instance, when you see that pit bull running up to you to tear you up, even in that instance, as your body naturally prepares you to fight or to run away in flight, call upon God in those instances. He will be there for you because he is God and God alone. He will give you peace, and he will speak to your frontal lobe to tell you what to do, whether to fight or to run away in flight. Okay? Our next part we'll talk about is the early losses and trauma. This is very important. Early losses and trauma. There's certain events that happens in people's life. And we're talking about people who have been through abuse as children, who were violated as children, who were ill-treated as children. Research have shown that early losses and even an emotional trauma may leave individual in more vulnerable, they're more vulnerable to depression later in life. So parents, we have to guard our children. We have to know who we have around our children. We have to watch how we're talking to our children and how we're rearing them, right? Because we can end up damaging them. And when we talk about early losses, we're talking about like a death of a parent, or even if you're not feeling loved from that parent, that's a loss. And these things affect how you live out the rest of your life, because you're going to have low self-esteem. You're going to think that no one will ever love you. You're not even going to love yourself. And so you're going to be more prone to depression. And later in life, when you are faced with stressful situations and you are faced with challenging situations, you will delve into depression even further. Any kind of disappointment will trigger a depressive episode. So early losses and early trauma can affect you throughout life when it comes on to depression. And there are many stories that are out there, especially from the Caribbean. Our parents used to whoop us something fierce, right? Because that's what they know. That's how they were raised. And that was not always the answer. Some children are more sensitive than some. Some children were negatively affected by these whooping, right? They think that they have been abused. And when you think of someone throwing a pot at you and throwing hot water at you, that's stretching it. That is no longer where you're trying to teach your child something. That's when you allow that anger within you to overcome your frontal lobe, and now you're being abusive. So there's a fine line, and we have to walk it. And I'm telling you, there are many stories out there, many things that we've heard as clinicians as to why people behave the way they behave now. All right? Trauma may also be indelibly etched in the psyche. So this is what I'm saying here. There's a study that was done in the Journal of American Medical Association that showed that women who were abused physically or sexually as children had more extreme stress responses than women that had not been abused. These women had higher level of the stress hormone ACTH and cortisol. And they, brothers and sisters, will always carry this with them. So we have to be careful. We have to be careful of how we're putting, or what we put our children through. Another thing that can affect depression are other medical problems. Other medical problems. Certain medical problems are linked to lasting significant mood disturbances. As a matter of fact, it's the root of up to 10 to 15% of all depression that happens here. The cause of it is another medical illness. All right? The number one culprit is usually the thyroid. Because remember, the adrenal gland and the pituitary gland produces hormones. And this, when you have hypothyroidism, which is too low of a hormone, or hyperthyroidism, which is when you have too much of that thyroid hormone. When you have too much, which is called hyperthyroidism, that can trigger a manic episode in a person with bipolar, right? And on the other hand, when you have hypothyroidism, when it's too low, that also leads to exhaustion and depression. So women are usually affected by the thyroid illness, usually hypo. So if you start to feel draggy and low, your motivation is low, when you go to the doctor for your physical, ask them to check their thyroid, because they're not often thinking about that. And that's very important. And men, also check your thyroid as well. You have a thyroid, and so it can also be affected. And the doctors do not think about that in male, but you too are also affected. Let's look at heart disease. Would you think that heart disease can lead to depression? I didn't put those two together. But it says when a person have a major heart attack, that once they come out of that and they have survived, then they have an increased risk of depression. Why? Because they just don't function the way as they did before. Especially those who have had open heart surgery, called a CABG, they usually have more effects of depression than others because it takes them a while to bounce back. And usually people who are affected by or had to go through a CABG, which is an open heart surgery, especially the younger members of society, when you're young and strong, you're used to doing what you were used to doing, you're physical, you're used to doing things your own way. After open heart and after surgery, then you have to relearn these things. And for most people, this can cause depression. This can cause depression. So we have to pay attention to that. Another one is things such as degenerative neurological conditions. So we're talking about multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and Huntington's disease. These are all disease that affects the brain. It affects like I showed you before, the myelin sheaths that happens in the brain. It affects that. And so these things lead to depression. Okay? Can you imagine? They now have an illness that they call early onset Alzheimer's disease. This is what happens to people who are above the age of 65. Do you know that there's a growing number of people below the age of 65 that are now being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, they can't remember. That short-term memory, they cannot remember what they were doing. Can you imagine being at work as an accountant, crunching numbers, and then all of a sudden, over time, you're forgetting what you're doing? You don't remember where you live. You're walking past your gate and can't remember where you live. Can you remember driving? Imagine driving down the road and can't remember where you're going. When these things happen, brothers and sisters, it is debilitating because now you can no longer function in the role that you had before. And it's going to go downhill from there because they're not yet at a stage where they can cure this. And it all have to do with the brain. It all it all deals with your neurotransmitters and your neurons. Another disorder that affects depression is a stroke. And what is a stroke? When you have a clot, think about a blood clot, and it goes to the brain, and it clogs off the blood flow to your brain. Can any area of your body function without blood? If that blood is not going back to the brain, the nutrients and all of that going back to your brain, what's going to happen? It's going to stroke out. It's going to die. So that is what's happening with a stroke. There's a clot, or there's a narrowing in the vessels going back to the brain. And then you have brain death. And so would you be depressed if you have a stroke and you can no longer function? If the left side of your brain is affected, the right side of your body is going to feel it. That's when you see a person with a stroke and you see them limping like this, that's because they had a brain stroke on this side of the brain. And so the neurons that have been damaged, whatever is damaged physically, it will be affected. Some people have slurred speech. They have one side of their face that's drooped and will no longer be the same again, right? Some people can't walk at all. Is that going to leave you depressed? What if you were an active functioning person before this happens? And a stroke happens quickly. It's not something that's slow and insidious. It is usually very quick. And so your life changes overnight. So we have to think about that. Also, let's look at some nutritional deficiencies, such as a lack of vitamin B12. This affects your brain. Other endocrine disorders, such as the parathyroid or adrenal gland that produces too much or too little of a hormone, that is called an endocrine disorder. That also affects how the brain works. Because like we talked about, the brain, the hippocampus in the brain is what talks to these, the parathyroid or the adrenal that tells it to produce the hormone. And so if that is being affected, then your brain will be affected. Certain immune diseases such as lupus, that will also affect how your brain works. Certain viruses such as hepatitis, HIV, the mononucleosis, this is the kissing disease. All of these things can affect your brain, right? When you have that thing blister on your lip, they call it the kissing illness or the kissing virus, because you pass it from mouth to mouth. It affects how you feel. Cancer. If you're diagnosed with cancer, how do you feel? Excited? Usually the doctor is telling you, oh, you have 6 months to live. You're going to be depressed. It affects your mood. Also, erectile dysfunction in men. Big, big thing for men. It would be big for me too if I was a man. Okay? So all these things affect your mood. So we see here there is a correlation between medical illness and depression. If depression or mania springs from an underlying medical problem, usually that mood disorder can be changed or disappear after the medical condition is what? Treated. So if you have hypothyroidism, for example, and you're lethargic and depressed, once you get the proper treatment for your hypothyroidism, then that depression will go away. All right? So you have to talk about what is causing the depression. Let's see what Sister Ellen G. White say about depression. She talks about some other causes of depression. Here she says in 4 Testimonies, page 64, she talked about the iron dignity. What was that? An iron dignity is a person that is cold and chilling, that is always, nobody wants to be around them because they're always just so cold. They're not loving. They can't see the good in anything. Everything that they do, they're putting it down. They're so pessimistic about everything. This, she's saying, will wither the good impulses and choke out the natural current of human sympathy, cordiality, and love. And under the influence of these people, you destroy other people's will. So you can't be cold and chill and everything has to be done your way or no way. No, you have to be able to accept love and to give love. You have to be able to have sympathy with others. And so this iron dignity, this cold reserve that is chilled and strong will, she said this is another cause of depression in others. Next one. She talked about a poorly ventilated room. Can you imagine that? A poorly ventilated room. The effects produced by living in close, ill-ventilated rooms are these. The system becomes weak and unhealthy. The circulation is depressed. The blood moves sluggishly through the system because it's not purified and vitalized by the pure, invigorating air of heaven. The mind becomes depressed and gloomy, while the whole system is enervated, and fevers and other acute diseases are liable to be generated. First volume of the Testimonies, page 702 and 803. So what she's saying is, if you're living in an area where you're not getting fresh air, then you are not going to be able to think properly, and you will be depressed because your mind is not going to be able to work properly. And this is also proven in science. They will tell you that if you're not breathing good air, you're not making good blood, and you can't make good decisions. So everything that the prophetess is saying here is provable in science. Another thing she talked about is insufficient oxygen, and we just went over that. So if the air is not allowed to expand and like it should. So when you take a deep breath, your lungs should expand to let in all the fresh air, right? So if you're in an area where you're sitting all the time like this and your lungs can't expand and you're cramping your lungs, and you could end up being very sick. And I wanted to know what she was talking about. And so I was looking through YouTube, and I found a culture in Asia. When they work each day, they stoop like this to preserve energy. So when they're cutting the yard, they stoop like this. When they're building, they stoop like this. They're in a stooped position for a very long time. Now, when you're in a stooped position, your lungs cannot expand the way it should. And so you're getting limited oxygen. And so you'll end up pretty sick. And the organ that is affected the most is the liver. It's the liver. The stomach and the liver and the brain are affected. So we have to be careful in some of the things that we're doing. And this quote comes to us from Ministry of Healing, page 272 and 273. She says, thus an insufficient supply of oxygen is received, the blood moves sluggishly, the waste, poisonous matter that should be thrown off in exhalation from the lungs is retained. And if you keep that toxin in, your blood becomes impure. And so the stomach is affected, the liver and the brain. The skin becomes sallow. The digestion is retarded and the heart is depressed. The brain is clouded and the thoughts are confused. And so you become depressed and inactive, and you're more prone to disease. Something as simple as not getting sufficient oxygen. So the little things is what we need to be looking at. Another big factor, brothers and sisters, is coldness in marriage. If you're married to the wrong person that is always putting you down, that will kill your spirit. And so we have to be careful of who we're connecting ourselves to. In First Testimonies of the volume 1 of the Testimonies, in page 696, she says here, she's talking to a brother, and she's saying, your grudging spirit is taxing your wife. You're burdening her. You're breaking down her spirit. And her disease, she says here, her disease is pain of the nerves. So even in our marriages, we have to love each other. We have to be tolerant of each other. We have to help each other to grow. We should not have iceberg kind of feeling towards and coldness towards our loved ones. We should be open enough to let the individual be themselves. You should not be trying to change this person. You should not be fault finding and putting down your spouse in any way, whether husband or wife. You should not be nitpicking at the person. You should allow them to be free. They're a sensitive plant. Allow them to flourish and grow, and you grow together. She says, if you do this, it has a chilling effect, and it will destroy the life of the plant, the life of the person. So we have to be careful of coldness in the marriage. If things are not going right in your marriage, go to God. You have to be able to submit yourself and learn how to say, I'm sorry, and change from there and want to change. This coldness in marriage have caused a lot of depression in our people in our church because they don't want to talk about it. And that's why the divorce rate is increasing to an alarming rate in the Seventh-day Adventist movement, even in present truth. Because they're so focused on doing the law, doing the letter of the law, that they're no longer thinking about the spirit behind it. And so you can be cold and fault-finding and nitpicking with your loved one, trying to see them perfect so that they can get to heaven while you're killing the spirit. And so we have to be careful. The Lord will hold us guilty when it comes on to this. Another thing is sexual excess. Too much, brothers and sisters. Okay? Too much of it can cause unhappiness. Paul says here in Romans 6 verse 12, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that ye should obey it in the lust thereof. He urges us onward by telling us, every man that striveth for the mastery is what? Temperate in all things. So the bottom line is, even in this beautiful part of marriage, we still also have to be temperate. She says here, very many families are living in a most unhappy state because the husband and father allows the animal in his nature to predominate over the intellect and the moral. Okay? Which turns around and causes languor and depression. So we have to balance everything, even the good thing. We also have to be temperate. This I mentioned here, I was going to take it out. But this one talk in Education Book 2, Education page 291, it talks about fault finding and nitpicking your children. If your child has a specific fault and we keep yelling at them and picking at that fault, usually what the children do is act as if they don't care, right? But on the bottom of it, they feel discouraged and hopeless. And they grow with this, and they're more prone to depression. So we have to be careful in how we're raising our children. Everyone will have some issues with them, but it's how we deal with it. And children don't know how to deal with stress, so they will just act as if they don't care. But really inside, they're broken. And they live with this, and they become so depressed later on in life. So we have to be very important. John 16 verse 33. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. So the Lord is the one who can take care of us, even in our depressive state. At this time, we're going to take a break, and then part 2, we will call in the 8 doctors. We will talk about the cure. How do we handle depression from a biblical point of view, a spiritual point of view, and a physical and medical point of view? We're going to call in the 8 doctors. We'll be right back in a few minutes to talk about that.